Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review episodes 17 through 27 of Spider Man, the 90s cartoon. So, going through here, immediately, I think a lot of these episodes are really just kind of gimmicks or guest starring kind of approaches to these episodes, which ultimately is completely fine, but in time, kind of the episodes for some of the points are kind of lackluster just because of just it ultimately just being like whatever is going to be tied to either the certain kind of guest star taking too much of the time to ultimately the story is just kind of like whatever it needs to be just to kind of finish up and just kind of have this kind of overall just like okay well ultimately the biggest thing was Spider-Man being teamed up with so and so character. So going into these episodes, there are some interesting things going on. Uh, there is, of course, X-Men being involved in here, Punisher being involved, Blade being involved. There's a lot of interesting story going on with this. We ultimately have some references, of course, of notable comic book characters, maybe uh, now so like some of these characters have kind of gone on to their own right to be their own thing instead of being 100% tied to Spider-Man now, or reason that you have it to where there's some characters that have a slight variation of I think their original story at some point. So going into here, we are going to go into some episodes. I think reasonably when looking at them, I think there's still some funny things going on here. We end up having Spider-Man end up talking to a gargoyle, which ultimately is a normal statue, and ultimately like this gargoyle is Peter's best friend, which I thought was interesting. How we keep going back to this statue for reasons. We end up having it to where Peter ultimately doesn't seem as quite whiny about his love life because ultimately he doesn't really have a love life, or what he is trying to get as a love life isn't going to be working out because we have it to where most of the focus is going to be on Peter's mutation within this story. So, or his mutation disease or whatever it's to be called. Interestingly enough, I thought recently, or um, I thought that recently the whole mutation angle was like, meh, I don't really care for the mutation angle. I don't know how many times that they tried to reuse that story through any portion of Spider-Man's life to have the whole mutation angle, where eventually there is some cure eventually to be had, and everything is to turn out fine. I think that there might be some stories that might go through this mutation thing a little bit better to eventually Peter does turn into a gigantic Spider-Man kind of being thing. So going into this, yeah, I thought that these moments were just kind of like, okay, let's get this kind of portion over with where we can eventually kind of get through into better stories where we have to avoid this whole like mutation Spider-Man thing. I think reasonably all of these characters were to justify having people come back or to especially be involved with the X-Men, which is kind of the first tie up and tee up. Uh, Ultimately, I thought that Punisher in this was kind of goofy looking, very much a bizarrely ish, high tech ish, like almost to the point of almost like a an Iron Man as far as tech goes, which I thought was bizarre. But we'll get to more of that in spoilers. Ultimately, we have it to where also like Blade looks really goofy in this story. There's a like he has kind of like a leather jacket and whatever kind of thing, but I think this Blade doesn't really have a true legitimate identity that otherwise just makes you go, oh yeah, this looks like the Blade that I've seen in any other comic book for the most point. Um, we have it to where Blade has weird gadgetry or weird weapons in this, and so ultimately I thought it was kind of odd through some of this how like we had to have all our villains have some kind of like laser gun ish like thing or something that looks close to it. Uh, yeah, so reasonably, let's go into spoilers about this episode. Let's crack open this spoiler time, usual time, to let me go into spoiling these episodes. So let's spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil these episodes. So ultimately, like I said, this is episode 17 through through 27. So ultimately, I'm gonna kind of really glaze through a lot of these episodes quickly. But then also there's gonna be uh, there's probably not gonna be a huge chunk of detail through a lot of these things. Just to kind of really comb through 10 different episodes and get them done as quickly as humanly possible. But yeah, so spoiler time. So we end up having it to where Peter is to be told that he has a mutation that he's dealing with, a mutation disease. And so we end up having it to where Peter ends up going to the only mutation expert that he knows, which is Charles Xavier. He ends up going and sneaking through a window of Charles's mansion, and we end up finding out that there's a booby trap onto seemingly any portion of the mansion if to whoever anyone was going to try to sneak in seemingly. We end up having it to where Spider-Man seemed to have been tied up via the X-Men, and so we ultimately have it to where people are interrogating Spider-Man, and eventually we end up having it to where Spider-Man ends up breaking free uh, of this contraption that he's tortured by, and eventually he heads into the danger room, which is on a high level risk. So we end up having it to where Spider-Man ends up trying to take down these Sentinels. Eventually, the X-Men go in and try to help him take down these Sentinels, and makes for a pretty interesting story to ultimately have it to where um, Peter's ultimately just saying, "Hey man, I was only here for Charles Xavier," and then Charles Xavier comes in. He's like, "Well, yeah, like I think he's telling the truth." So ultimately, we have it to where Peter ultimately asks Charles to help him with this mutation problem, and Charles is like, you know what, I'm sorry, uh, like I don't deal with getting rid of a mutation. I get like I'm only here to like help people that are mutated. So we end up having it to where like Peter is just like, well, what good did that do? Like I'm freaking out of here. So we end up having it to where Peter ends up running off and Beast ends up running off after him, which also leads Wolverine to eventually also kind of leave as well. So reasonably, that's just kind of what 17 really is for the most point. There might be some interesting dialogue going in there between X Men and between Spider Man. Reasonably, I kind of like the fact that ultimately, when looking at it, we had like an ultimate story where eventually Spider Man and Wolverine eventually change places at some point. So this kind of like this episode kind of reminds me of that a little bit. And eventually, we have Spider Man and Wolverine in the next episode. So, speaking of which, we ultimately have it to where we end up having Spider-Man desperately trying to seek out for a cure. Eventually, he is to head to talk to Craven's wife to eventually try and figure out if he can find a cure. And so ultimately, we end up having it to where Wolverine is eventually looking for Beast because we have it to where seemingly Wolverine can't find Beast anywhere. It seems like he's been gone out for too long. We eventually find out that Landon supposedly had taken Beast and tried some experiments on him to recreate the experiment that Beast had done, so on and so forth, yada yada yada. We end up having it to where eventually Spider-Man and Wolverine eventually go and end up finding out where Beast lays his head, so to speak. And so we end up having it to where Wolverine ends up going and jumping onto the cage to otherwise try to free Beast, and the cage ends up is electrified, and so Wolverine ends up getting knocked out. It seems that also we find out that the rope had gotten cut from Beast's cage, so Spider-Man has to jump to go and grab onto the cage with his bare hands and kind of keep it where it's at. So Wolverine is knocked unconscious, and eventually Beast is trying as much as humanly possible to shake him out of it. And so we end up having it to where eventually Wolverine does regain consciousness, and so ultimately we end up having it to where, in the funny moment that I thought was interesting when Peter ultimately said, or Spider-Man said, it's like, "Hey, just don't make me laugh." So we end up swinging Wolverine. Wolverine ends up taking the cage and ends up swinging it back and forth to have them fly further away from where the actual drop point of this huge batch of green goop is to uh, be a thing to otherwise, excuse me, mutate Beast any further. So it seems in the end that eventually we get it to where Landon ends up dropping himself into a vat of toxic waste, and he ends up turning into a big, huge Godzilla-esque like monster. Where eventually we have it to where the science of Beast and Spider-Man are working together on an experiment to otherwise dissolve this whole Godzilla like monster thing. We end up, I think the best part is when we have all like X-Men and Spider-Man ultimately all in the Quinjet together trying to solve this whole puzzle. So we end up having it to where the monster ends up getting destroyed, and we end up having all the X-Men all just kind of like so proud that they were with Spider-Man. Ultimately, Gambit is saying like, "You're one ace, boy," and like God, like we have to have all like the card puns, I guess, with Gambit. So we end up having it to where Wolverine eventually mentions to Spider-Man, it's like, well, hey man, like if anything, like if you don't have anybody, like you're family to us, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where everybody is just talking about how great, like how really great that Spider-Man is. And so ultimately, like he ends up leaving, and they end up kind of calling it a wrap for that. So moving on. So we ultimately have it to where there seems to be some kind of job opening for this science lab. So we end up having Deborah, who seemingly is with Flash Thompson right now, or it seems like they're eventually going to become a couple. Because it seems that ultimately Deborah is trying to do some experiments and so on and so forth. So we eventually also have Michael Morbius, who is trying to figure out what experiment he can do. And we have it to where Peter is having a batch of blood that seemingly is in some uh, place where ultimately Michael is going to try and steal this blood sample. So we end up having it to where Michael has to come up with the most creative thing that ultimately is going to beat out the competition. And so ultimately, he ends up stealing a thing of blood that he doesn't realize is Peter's blood. And we end up having Michael Morbius experimenting on bats. Eventually, the bat ends up going and biting Michael Morbius. And so we seemingly have it to where eventually that Michael is to eventually become a vampire at some point, but we end up having it to where mostly in this episode that Peter is to deal with his mutation, and it seems to be really writhing up. It seems that really we have it to where Peter can't do what he used to because when really looking at it, uh, like he is getting really very sick or whatever from this mutation. So moving on. So eventually we have it to where seemingly there is a debt that is on the head of Spider-Man via uh, uh, Jameson, and so we end up having it to where Punisher ends up answering the call to basically be Spider-Man's nemesis. So we end up having it to where ultimately, I'm gonna put on a thing there. Anyways, um, we end up having it to where reasonably, Punisher ends up going on into uh, trying to take down Spider-Man, ultimately trying to kill him using his battle van to try to take down Spider-Man and all the bizarre tech things that he has, like a jetpack and so on and so forth. We eventually have it uh, to where Peter ends up getting an upper hand and the Punisher ends up kind of webbing him to a wall, but eventually we have it to where the battle van ends up kind of taking down this web. So eventually we have it to where really Punisher is trying to sniff out Peter, and eventually we have it to where Peter is to also eventually become this monster, and so we eventually have it to where Peter is becoming this monster, and so we end up having it to where Craven ends up coming to the fray, and Punisher ends up trying to take down this monster that ultimately ended up scaring some woman. So we end up going on and having seemingly Punisher and Craven working together, and eventually Craven's wife ends up after Punisher and Craven work together to kind of take down this giant spider. We ultimately have it to where Craven ends up putting some medication to Peter to kind of cause him to go back to normal for I don't know how long. So we end up having it to where eventually Punisher ends up giving up on the fact that it's like, well, hey, like there's no way I'm going to be able to bring this guy in and it all work out. So moving on, so we end up having it to where Morbius ends up becoming a vampire, and so or a living vampire, and so we end up having it to where that is to call upon Blade coming to town. And so we end up having, like, funny enough, we end up having it to where Blade assumes that Spider-Man is a vampire because I guess he has to just naturally assume with this guy being uberly strong that he would have to just assess that he's a vampire. Excuse me. So we end up having it seemingly where Blade ends up attacking Spider-Man with a thing of garlic, and ultimately it does nothing to Spider-Man, and ultimately Blade is like, okay, well then you must not be a vampire then. So we end up having it to ultimately that it seems that we are to find out that when Eugene or Flash Thompson is otherwise going to be uh, in the arms of another woman, we end up finding that Deborah is just really saddened by all that. So it's kind of interesting to see that ultimately Flash Thompson doesn't realize what good thing he has until it's gone, kind of thing. So we end up having it to her ultimately. So that was kind of a side story. I don't know why I brought this in this episode, but anyways, so we end up having it to where Blade is coming into the fray to otherwise kind of stall Michael Morbius from biting anybody. And we have to where Morbius is eventually, through most of this episode, trying to delay ending up attacking anybody, even though really it's so tempting. We eventually have it to where we have Peter ending up taking Spider Man. Or no. What ends up happening is Spider Man ends up, I think, putting a tracker on Blade's vehicle, and then Spider Man ends up tracking Blade down, and we end up having it to where Whistler ends up telling the backstory of Blade to Spider Man. Kind of a really interesting approach to ultimately getting to know this character by Whistler, of course, telling the story. So, going on here, eventually we have it to our Detective Lee, is going to be tied to the story and eventually even tied to Blade, which I thought was really interesting. How eventually they had it to where Blade and her had locked lips, which I thought was cool. So we end up having it to where ultimately Spider-Man and Blade are teaming up together to otherwise go after Morbius. And so recently the whole next episode is really just tied to uh, eventually Morbius becoming a big giant vampire or a big giant bat, or ultimately ends up attacking people. And we end up having it eventually where Morbius ends up flying off and Blade ends up flying off after him. It seems that ultimately, after hearing the news about um, that Blade could quite possibly become human again, because uh, there's a device that could otherwise change uh, Blade's DNA, and so ultimately we are to have Blade quite possibly have hope of no longer being a vampire again. So we end up having it to where Morbius ends up kind of flying off, and Blade ends up realizing that he will never ever not become a vampire. That ultimately is mostly just kind of fueled by revenge, and so on and so forth. So kind of interesting notions going on in these episodes. I really like the whole vampire angle. Kind of like it, Blade kind of felt forced being put in here, but meh, I guess it is what it is with these episodes. So, all right. So, episode 24. It seems like there is a tablet of time, not a tablet that ultimately you can hold in your hand, a big like Akhman Ra like Egyptian tablet kind of thing that ultimately has some kind of thing of time where ultimately it seems that one person could ultimately go into this pyramid that ultimately has it to where ultimately if the sun hits it just right, you can end up having a person end up changing from being older to being younger. So we end up having it seemingly where Adrian Toomes seems to be a person that wants to be able to fund this um, this ancient time tablet to not only be exactly where he's at, but because ultimately he's kind of seeing towards his end, he's ultimately realizing that, man, if he was younger again, he would be able to take down all of his enemies. And so we end up having it to where Adrian Toomes ends up going uh, and trying to put this thing together. Ultimately, we eventually have it to where it seems that Toomes ends up going and trying to hire Dr. Connors to study this thing and also try to put together some items to otherwise try and help out Toomes. So it seems that after this, we eventually get it to where ultimately Dr. Connors ultimately is eventually going to be kidnapped by Silvermane, and we end up having that moment where Spider-Man is ultimately going to try and prevent Dr. Connors from being kidnapped, and ultimately we have it to where Silvermane ultimately is talking to Peter because there's gas that is filling in the room, and ultimately Peter's like, hey, like, we're gonna all suffocate. And ultimately, Silvermane is like, well, that's great and all, but I don't need to breathe. So we ultimately have it to where eventually Peter ends up incapacitating Silvermane anyways. And so eventually we have it to where we're just to kind of like push on to these other episodes and so on and so forth. So eventually at some point we eventually have it to where uh, to where eventually the Vulture is, of course, Adrian Toomes, and eventually we have it to where Adrian eventually turns into a much younger version of himself. It seems like every time he consumes people, he turns into a younger version of himself. I don't know what it is with all of this. We end up having it to where like Morbius is sucking the life out of people, and now Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture, is sucking the youth out of people. So, but it seems like he only has the youth for a certain amount of time. So eventually we have it to where ultimately Toomes is just sucking the life out of everybody to the point of even getting to suck the life out of Spider-Man. And so ultimately we have it to where Adrian is like, oh my god, I need to be able to uh, use this energy to my best benefit. But eventually we have it to where ultimately uh, we have it to where Adrian is trying to keep Spider-Man so ultimately he can keep draining the youth out of him. But it seems that ultimately Spider-Man is now an elderly person, which ultimately he tries to call off work, but ultimately we have it to where there's a different voice that ultimately doesn't sound quite like Peter's. It sounds like an old man. So we end up pushing on to ultimately have it to where eventually Peter seems at some point to eventually get his youth back, but we eventually have Peter who is kind of really very much having a close call between both uh god, what was it? uh I messed that up a little bit. So, oh my god. But eventually we have it to where like I guess out of stress we end up finding out the lizard ultimately we ultimately have it to where Dr. Connors ends up changing to the lizard from time to time based off of stress. So we end up having it to where Adrian Toomes sucks the life out of Spider-Man, and eventually we have it to where uh, Spider-Man ends up trying to evade and hide and otherwise justifiably even try to save a person from being mugged. And eventually we have it to where ultimately he helps him and ultimately tells him like, hey, me and the elderly gotta stick together kind of thing. So we eventually have it to where ultimately Spider-Man is old and ultimately is to go up against Scorpion. Scorpion is tying himself to Adrian Toomes to ultimately have Adrian Toomes help Scorpion turn back to who he actually was. So we end up having it uh, to where we end up having tours. Vulture ends up going and tries to get Peter and tries to attack Peter, but the problem with that is eventually it costs them the equipment to be able to do any number of these things, and so we end up having it to where Peter has to come up with some solutions and stuff like that, but we also have it to where there seems to still be a mutation flare up, and so we eventually get it to where ultimately they end up doing this experiment to ultimately transfer because ultimately Doc Connor is ultimately working on trying to excel Peter onto Vulture so it can work permanently. So we end up having it to where eventually we find that seemingly Doctor Strange, Doctor Connors had adjusted the way of the machine, and so we end up having it to where the mutated disease had been gone from Peter and went right into the Vulture, where ultimately now he's flying around as like a Spider-Man, a literal Spider-Man. So we end up having it to where seemingly the destruction of this machine ultimately costs Scorpion uh, his ability to go back to his normal self. And so ultimately, everybody is like, man, there's no way that we can recreate any of this equipment all over again and just retry. There's no way that we can be able to do that. So that kind of resolves all of that. So, yeah, other than that, yeah, it was a pretty good episode. I kind of really quickly went over a lot of these episodes, but at the end of the day, I think that's all I wanted to say about these episodes. Kind of really interesting, but it's really just special guest heavy for these episodes. So I think that's all I wanted to say about these ones. I kind of skimmed through a lot of them, so I apologize, but otherwise, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.